Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for joining us. This week, we're talking about the Cosmos 1408 anti-satellite test and India's and China's latest tests in the last few years. We'll also talk about 5 years with AG3D and all that I've learned and thankful for. Thanks for joining us. Hey everybody, welcome to Today in Space. I'm your space science podcast host from the East Coast, Alex Giorfanos, and it is the week of Thanksgiving. We're recording this on Monday, November 22nd, and we missed last week because these regular-ass colds that we have now in the winter that's not COVID have either gotten stronger or my immune system's not finely tuned for these anymore. Maybe it's a little bit of both, but man, that has put me out. That's the second time I've had something like that recently, like a flu-like thing going around. I hear everyone sniffling around us at work, so it's just something going around. So short story is I sounded like crap, and this week we're not even doing a video for YouTube. We're just doing pure audio. So I am recovering, and this week we've got a lot to cover. There's a lot of this is a good episode to put on your drive up for the holiday. You know, if you're looking for something in the background, you want to learn a little bit of something. I got a few stories this week that aren't necessarily space related, but it's all in just let's put a good episode out so that if you want to throw us on in the background while you're doing some stuff, listen in. We appreciate you. This is Today in Space. If you're new, if you haven't already, go over to our Instagram page, Today in Space Pod, our 3D printing lab at AG3D Printing, and check us out there. Follow us on social media. Facebook, the Today in Space podcast group. There's also on TikTok, we're on Today in Space. And of course, this podcast, if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever else you are listening to the podcast, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you share it with people. We really appreciate all the support. Subscribing is free for you, right? Even on YouTube, right? Clicking that bell, clicking the like button. It's basically free for you, and it helps us in so many different ways. So if you want to help and give back to this little bit of science we try and put out every week, science and storytelling, really, about the space industry and being a nerd and an engineer. Yeah, so if you're interested in any of that, please feel free. Subscribe. That helps us out a lot. So since the last episode, there was an anti-satellite test that was done by Russia of the spy satellite Cosmos 1408. You probably saw it over in the news that Russia deliberately blew up a satellite, and that debris potentially could have impacted the International Space Station. The astronauts on board which Crew 3 that just got there, they woke up to basically protocols for them to start going into their spacecraft, because if something hit the pressurized space station in the wrong spot, that's bad news bears. You need a pressurized vehicle to be in, because the space station is not going to be able to close those doors and hatches in time. Like, this is the thing of sci-fi nightmares, right? Just imagine waking up to the really calm person over the phone on the comms. Good morning. We're going to be starting from the this procedure step. Make sure to go through to like code alpha, or whatever it is that the terminology that it is. Sounds very dry if you don't know what it is. But could you imagine being that astronaut being like, that's the procedure where we try to go to our spacecraft because something's going to impact us. All right, let's wake up. Like that is what our astronauts, and not only just the U.S. astronauts, all the astronauts on board, the Russian cosmonauts that were on board, everyone had to seek refuge in the spacecraft. And this I think it was like 2,500 pieces of debris right now, the latest research. Leo Labs did a really good breakdown, initial investigation of the debris. And yeah, 2,500 pieces of debris that are now, they're passing so many low Earth orbit satellites, a lot of different orbits. So there's just so much potential for future impacts that are uncontrolled, and it just really was bad choices all around. from a, do you want to keep space being an easy thing for us to do as human beings? If that was the choice, it was not a good choice. So I don't know what's going on there. There's only conjecture, but the reality is there's now more debris across many different high activity, very useful orbits that we use on an everyday basis. And what I wanted to do is this isn't, we can't just single out Russia. It's not like Russia's the only one that has done this. The U.S. did this many times early on because space warfare. I mean, look, Sputnik is what spawned the whole space race that we had with Russia, the U.S. had with Russia, to go to the moon. It was Sputnik was this thing that was orbiting around all the time and viewing the Earth, Area 51, all those places that we had very secret stuff going on. Now they could just send a camera that's so far away we would have no idea that it was even there. Terrifying prospect. And so there were a lot of tests done of like, all right, what happens if we shoot this satellite down? Can we test the rocket to make sure that it hits its target? And then what is the debris that happens from that? What's the fallout of using that maneuver militarily in space? The U.S. stopped doing that. Many countries stopped doing that. And we've only had a few of these in the last, looks like, 2 decades. So if you go far back to 2007, China had an anti-satellite test. And in 2007, they created 3,000 objects, mostly that are still there now. And at that time, they were basically said that they'd be there for decades. So it's a high chance that many of those objects are still there. And it's at altitudes of 865 kilometers, which is crazy, and it's not even necessarily a circular orbit, right? That this is taking place. In 2019, India had an anti-satellite test, April 15th, 2019. And they actually, that one's a little more interesting, where it's kind of like a modern version of an anti-satellite test. Granted, still not good. Still really not good to put debris that you can't control traveling at speeds of like the speed of a bullet, basically, relatively, right? If you're a person on the ground, that thing is moving faster than it would if it moved through air. So, yeah. So April 15th, 2019, India sent up, they launched on January 19th of that year, they launched a small satellite that was built for the purpose of being destroyed. It went up to a lower altitude of 282 kilometers, and when it was destroyed, there were 400 fragments that, because of such a low altitude, they pretty much would have, destroyed in weeks to months of that explosion, and that missile impacting that satellite. And some of that debris, even though it was controlled and it was done low, some of that debris still went up to altitudes of 1,000 kilometers. So the whole story of anti-satellite tests is, the reason you do it is for warfare. The reason you do it is to posture. It's kind of this whole thing with, and again, I'm generalizing here, but the basic idea is anti-satellite tests are meant for war. That's essentially why you would use them and why you test them. There are definitely military demonstrations done all the time to showcase technologies and posture and all those different things. But that's 2 anti-satellite tests within 3 years, from India's test in 2019 to China's test in 2007. That's a 12-year gap. We've now had 2 in the last few years, and it's definitely a trend we hope that doesn't continue. But the good thing is, every time this has happened, we seem to get more and more eyes, and we're in a really good time for civilian space activities, where there's just so much. Space Twitter is really one of the nicer things that I use Twitter for. There's a really cool group of people that are all looking at the stars, gathering data, This Jonathan McDowell is amazing. He's over here in I think MIT, right? I think he's out here in one of the observatories. Regardless, I've been following him for years, so it's cool to know that he's up close here in Boston. But yeah, there's just a lot of really cool people, a lot of people who are looking at this stuff. It's not going unnoticed. So I mean, the whole reason they found out this test happened is because they were looking at where this thing should have been and it wasn't there. And then when they looked again, there was a whole bunch of things there. So um, yeah, it's an interesting anecdote. It's not the first time that's happened, and we definitely hope that there are less anti-satellite tests. If you want to learn more about what's being done to fix space debris, we had a great interview with Luca Rosatini, who is the CEO and one of the founders of Deorbit, which is a company that specifically tailors solutions for satellites to be able to be deorbited. So solutions that, hey, if your satellite loses power and can't function anymore, there's still some solid fuel on there that you can activate separate from the system, and be able to put it on a trajectory that it needs to burn up into the atmosphere. There's also they are doing launch services. They flew on a SpaceX Falcon 9 recently, and they have this really cool craft that deploys all these different satellites into very unique and specific orbits that customers would want to pay for. Optimize the amount of time you have. Let's say if you're mapping certain areas of the planet, you want to maximize kind of how many passes, right? You would want a lot of passes so you have a very nice scan or grid of whatever you're looking at, right? You don't necessarily do that. You don't necessarily get that from attaching yourself to another launch, right? Like you're just jumping on a launch that Falcon 9's doing for a bigger thing. Like you're kind of limited in what you can do from there. So that's what their latest option that they tested is out there. So there's a lot of cool stuff that's being done. There's some more people. There's Privateer Space. That's a young company that's out there apparently doing some of that stuff too. But that's just what I've heard on Twitter. But they're doing pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of really small companies, startup companies in this industry that are trying to do really cool things. And we'll definitely try and touch more on those companies here in the future. Another thing that I want to talk about in the coming weeks is the spin launch that just happened recently. I don't know if you guys saw it. A giant centrifuge spins a rocket on the end of an arm inside of a vacuum-controlled chamber, and then it just yeets that thing into the atmosphere. And they tested that for the first time. It's like a subscale model. It worked. They tossed something into orbit. They threw it straight up so that they weren't going to hurt anybody. But ideally, this thing would launch at like 30-degree angle, and they're going to the next stage of building the first real version of it. So I've been doing a bunch of research, a bunch of people sending some questions and ideas. A bunch of you guys were like, I got articles from all of you before I even saw it. So it's always a good sign that that's something we should talk about in the show. So I wanted to do my research, get a bunch of cool things together, and I've got some like cool sci-fi and like what it could be in the future kind of stuff. So look forward to that in the future. I am still researching that. Moving on, we definitely need to talk about our 3D printing lab called AG3D, which on November 23rd, 2016, I started full-time. So that's 5 years of our 3D printing lab, which is crazy because I remember when I started it, I remember thinking, okay, I feel like it's going to be like it's almost like I'm going to college again, but for something very specific. And like the courses are just mine, right? Like I get to learn what I want to learn. And that's how I approached this crazy and amazing adventure into 3D printing, which started as just something that I came across researching for this podcast. And then it became the thing that funds this podcast and gets us to go around the world, really the U.S. right now. But it's helping us get the podcast out to everyone around the world, and then go to things like when things open up, Starship in Texas and other launches, going to other places and visiting new companies, things like that. it has made all of that possible. So I can't even believe it's 5 years. So much has happened. In that time, we've learned that iterative design is really our bread and butter. We can bring an idea from a piece of paper into reality pretty rapidly, and along the way we can make it better. That's kind of what we focus on, is so that by the time we get to the end, the final thing, it's gone through a few tests of like, is this what I want? Which is not something you necessarily get from going to like some semi big company that's just like an idea machine, and they just crank out prototypes that you might be able to do, or it's not quite what you're looking to do, and you've already spent a whole bunch of money, so now you're sunk into it. Now you put that money into a mold, and then you have to sell a whole bunch of things that aren't really at the point like you've thought of all these different things you want to make better, but because you sunk all that money into this mold to make hundreds of thousands of parts, you need to sell those hundred thousands of parts to buy a new mold. So that is very expensive if you're trying to bring an idea from, if you're trying to start a business, if you're trying to, even if it's just like, I want to make one of these things, the cost of machining a single custom piece is very, very high. And while we can trade off a little bit on, it might take a little bit longer because I am just a one-person shop, and we are focused on certain things different than machining, right? So like we can make a lot more complex shapes in maybe a little more time, but it's going to be way less money than you're going to spend on machining on average. So there is a lot that we do here, and that's one of the big things. I've been designing since I was in college, so at this point that's like 13 years of design, and that doesn't even make sense, honestly. If I really think about how many years that is of actually designing, it's kind of wild. And like at work, what I'll do is like, if I have like, I usually work through lunch, and sometimes we're like, oh, this would be a really cool idea, and I'll just whip out the design program and design something and put it on something and print. And that is from 5 years of running my own 3D printers and making sure that they're running, fixing anything that goes wrong with them, tweaking them so they print even higher quality, stronger parts. Dial in all those things. I loved that stuff. That's all that the early days of the AG3D Instagram is like me tweaking what was our first 3D printer, which was the XYZ printing DaVinci Pro 3-in-1, which had like a laser engraver attachment and has a 3D scanner built in, and it's also a 3D printer. But that had its problems, and I ended up moving on to a different 3D printer, which was then the Prusa Mark II, which is the Prusa I3 Mark II is the 3D printer that I really, really scratched my teeth on. Of like, I cut my teeth. What is that saying, anyways? That's a terrible saying. It sounds painful. Anyways, where I really got to learning what a 3D printer is when I built the kit of this 3D printer. That's what I recommend for anybody. If you want to get into 3D printing and you really want to learn it fast, rapidly, buy yourself a 3D printer. Go on like the Prusa, and that has like a big forum, and go after it. There, you've got all the people that you need there. There's so much support out there. There's so much stuff that you can learn that's out there. And so, anyways, we continued. The Prusa Mark II really helped us build a lot of really cool stuff. Like we 3D printed a knife holder of Deadpool, so you put the knives in his head. It was like a project someone else did. And I made one custom for my brother. That was like one of the big projects. Then we realized that a lot of the people that we were talking to really wanted to print bigger than the Prusa. So then we went with a large format 3D printer like the CR10S5, which is 500 millimeters cubed. It's like 19 inches in X, Y, and Z. So it's huge. It's a giant printer. And then we printed more and more. We started getting into cosplay stuff. I made the Iron Man arc reactor that I wore in the t-shirt, which was sweet. I upgraded that Prusa to a new version, which is great about that 3D printer and that company. They're always trying to make sure you get the most out of that printer, and it's an absolute workhorse. And that's I absolutely love running 3D printers. Like, I never would have thought that like I would have gotten into this robotics and electronics maker thing. I don't know. It wasn't really available when I was growing up. So like to find it now, I'm like, oh yeah, I would have loved this growing up. On the bigger 3D printer, we printed our giant Mandalorian helmet, which was a whole saga in itself, and then there was so much learning that we did. And then COVID happened, and we started getting into 3D printing masks, and then we found that the masks were just, it all came down to the filter, right? So you can make a mask, but it's all about the filtration that you're using. So we moved away from that because it just wasn't safe. I wasn't going to promise people that we could make the masks if there really wasn't something that we could say that was helpful. The more science came out, it didn't work. So we ended up moving to things like reliefs, like the strap reliefs for the ones that went over your ears, because that was a big thing. And then face shields is where we ended up donating a bunch of those and sending those out. So that is, COVID has really shown what 3D printing can do, especially with a very sensitive supply chain. And that's what we're experiencing now, right? With everything that's going on with the supply chain across the world right now, like every industry is affected. And when the supply chain is down and someone has a 3D printer and supplies, you have the ability to make something that is not available anywhere else. And you don't have, the only thing you have to hold inventory of is basically your filament and some spare parts for the 3D printer. So for me, as someone that is looking to make something, I have the ability, because our supply of filament plastic hasn't been low. It's actually been pretty good. It's held through. Like we can make stuff if we have to. Like if we can't get it, we can do that. It's not a reality I thought we were going to be at when I started AG3D 5 years ago. But these are the things you learn, right? You pick up on. And so we've learned a lot. Like it's really been an incredible journey. It got me into working in the 3D printing industry. Like my day job is in 3D printing. That is what I do every day. And I would not be here if I didn't start AG3D all that time ago. And what I've learned, like being an aerospace engineer out of college and then starting my own company at, 5 years ago, 26, it taught me so much. It got me out of my shell as the aerospace engineer. It taught me so much about what a company needs to do. Like now when I go to my day job, I don't just think about like what I'm dealing with. I also think about like, how is the whole company affected? What are the things that I do for my company that I'm seeing either needing help, or like is this a place in which I can help? Is that something that's just part of being a business? It gives me a really nice vantage point to learn in all the different aspects that we're doing, because of course one day it would be great. I would love to be able to have this lab be a place where we could have employees and be able to have other people with 3D printers out there, so we could more rapidly get parts to people. Like there's obviously a lot we want to do, but one step at a time, one step at a time. And I'm not sure where I was going with that. I lost track there. But yeah, it's been really cool. Of course, one day we would love to have some people that we could employ. But for now, we've learned a lot in 5 years. We're still here. We've made it through the pandemic. And we're looking forward to how we can help bring everyone's ideas into reality that is looking for that kind of thing with 3D printing. And we're starting to get into a little bit of injection molding, 3D printing molds, so that we can scale parts up, because we've reached this interesting stage now 5 years in where some of these ideas have really kicked off and we can now start making a lot of these at a time. We can really start speeding up what we can produce. And so going back to the original point about money being too expensive for molds, if you have a 3D printed mold, the cost of that mold is very low. So you get the ability to put out a lot more parts at a time. So you increase your manufacturing capacity, and your part quality goes up because you got mold finish. So your part quality goes up, the amount of parts you can have goes up, and the cost of your tooling is way, way, way down. So I'm going to be playing with vacuum pots and some molds. That's going to be kind of the side projects as we develop here, probably through the end of the year into next year. I want to dial that in. I worked in injection molding early on. It's one of the really cool things about my journey, as I look back on, is I got my first real job was at a place called Westminster Tool in Plainfield, Connecticut, and worked for Ray Coombs, who's the president, the owner. He taught me so much about traditional manufacturing, and that whole thing about 3D printing taking over traditional manufacturing. There's no way. It's another tool in the basket of manufacturers. It helps you do things that traditional manufacturing can't do, and traditional manufacturing can do things that 3D printing can't do. So it's just another tool that's extremely valuable. And seeing traditional, I remember my last point here, my last story time with Alex. I remember that when I walked into the manufacturing floor for the first time, this was at Westminster, I remember there was a point during my internship with them where I remember seeing all the machines, and I remember thinking, by the time I get out of here, I don't know why I was thinking this, but I was like, at a certain point in my career, I want to get to the point where I can walk into a place and look at one of these machines and know what it is, or be close to knowing what it is or what it isn't, right? To walk in and be like, oh, that's a 5-axis mill, or oh, that's a lathe, or that's a screw injection mold machine, things like that. That's a 5-axis arm. Oh, that's a 3D printer. That's an SLA 3D printer. That's SLS 3D printer. That's an FDM 3D printer, like the ones we have in our labs. And I got there. I'm actually there at this point. Having worked on 3D printers, there's so much that you can take from the manufacturing world, G-code and just linear systems, right? Things that are moving left and right and up and down. That's what machinists have been working on forever. So it's a natural evolution, but it's both an old industry and a young industry at the same time. It's been around long enough that you can actually make real parts with it finally, but it's also really young in that it really hasn't had a chance to go to this next stage where we get one step closer to this being like the replicator in Star Trek, right? Where you can just kind of click a button, Earl Grey, hot, and then it makes you an Earl Grey tea that's actually hot, that tastes just like Earl Grey tea, and apparently doesn't affect your insides, right? Because they were using that thing all the time on Star Trek, and I don't think that any of them died of cancer. So I think at some point that would be great to get to, especially if we're using light, right? Light and energy to create matter. I think at that point it'll be non-carcinogenic. But until then, we've got a long way to go. But I definitely see at some point this being a huge tool for designers, right? If you think about all the things that we're going to purchase over the next few weeks for the holidays coming up here, think about how much of that money is going to a manufacturer, how much is going to the actual designer that made that thing, right? If you go on Etsy or something like that. 3D printers could at some point eliminate so much of the middlemen for designers to go direct to their consumer, right? at what point do designers become the manufacturers? And designers have these 3D printers in their homes, and they basically just source out material, right? Their cost for their designs is their design and the literal cost of it being manufactured. So the designer could really make the money that they deserve for designing their thing in a very near future. Near is probably decades, but who knows? It's getting closer and closer every day, and it's a very fun industry. So if you're ever interested in learning more about 3D printing, head on over to ag3d-printing.com. That's our website. We have a YouTube channel. We've made, anytime we make something or we do something cool, we try to put a YouTube video together. Halloween costumes, I usually do an episode on that. We had our Starman helmet. We've got a video, a clip up on that channel at AG3D Printing on YouTube, so if you want to check that out. You can also check out the Deadpool knife holder, which is pretty sweet. Yeah, so that's pretty much it, folks. I'm going up to vacation land. I'm going up to Maine for Thanksgiving. It's going to be great. There's going to be a deep fried turkey. It's going to be some football. It's going to be good. And funnily enough, last story, if you're not from Massachusetts, there's two places where people go to vacation, at least traditionally. People who are from Massachusetts, massholes. There's two places that we go. There's Maine. You go up north to Maine, to vacation land, or you go east to the Cape, to Cape Cod. And I was a Cape person forever because we had a house down there. And so I never went to Maine. And then now as I get older, going up to Maine, and it's great. I mean, it's totally different, right? I probably wouldn't want to go to the Cape now because it's super cold down there. It's not great near the water. But there's something about Maine that it's going to be cold, and it makes it almost like you're enjoying it, but not really. But still, it's beautiful up there. Plus, the stargazing up there is great. We don't get as good of stars down the Cape as we do if we go up to Maine. So, yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing some stars, having some good time, some rest, a deep fried turkey. Yeah, delicious. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving if you're from the U.S. If you're in anywhere else around the world, thank you for joining us. And I just want to say that I am thankful for all of you. If you made it this far in a podcast and you listened this long, boy, do I appreciate you guys hanging in there. But I appreciate every single one of you. We're really trying to build a community here. So if you haven't already, reach out. Love to hear from you. todayinspacepodcast@gmail.com if you've got any episode ideas or things you want to talk about that's space related, 3D printing related. We've got some interviews coming up later this year. So there's a lot to come. We thank you so much for joining us. This is Today in Space. I am Alex Girofanos. Have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Today in Space.